We are. We should be hopefully finishing up the section on world and maybe going on to section 29, which is being in as attunement. And oh yeah, did you get the thing in the mail? Did it get to you? Oh, you got it. Okay. Did you? And you got the thing with the the kind of projection of the text.
Thank you.
Okay. Good. Okay. So the idea here, once again, is we're really right now focusing in the existential analytic, right? Which is the only part of the book that's finished, right? Is this existential analytic of Heidegger. And as you know, and just to go back over things in a sense, we started, the last couple of weeks with world and environmentality, and world as environment, right? Which is the presupposition before space, right? In Heidegger's thinking, right? World itself and worlding world is always an a priori, for Heidegger, right? This is the beginning, right? And as we talked about in terms of thinghood and things in the world, that the Zunhanden, the ready to hand as tools, right, was one aspect of this, and he'll talk about this in terms of relatedness, and if you remember as well as reference and signs. And this is his beginning attempt at language in terms of use of language and relational uses of language, which is so the Zunhanden, and then the Vorhanden are the things present to hand, the now, which we'll see later. The present to hand is also incorporated in the succession of now times, and this yields ultimately what Lukács, of course, and others called reification, right? And this is very much active in Lukács's view of objectivity and the relation of subject, object, and history and class consciousness to what Heidegger calls objectively present. Now, this again are ontic determinations, out of which, we'll see today, I hope, the Descartes is in this world. That his method and his universalis mathesis, looking at that over there, we're going to talk more about that today, is actually frames our world of objectively present. Okay? But behind this, again, is world, and the Zunhanden is his first example of really relational thinking. Right? Yeah, going forward, right? We want to keep this in mind. And I mentioned as well that the Stiglerian problematic comes out of the Zunhanden, at least as technics as time, right? Technics and time. For Stigler, the Epimethian fault, the brother of Prometheus, who's really by default, right, is the world of Zunhanden, right? The world of use of things, right? Exactly. Not the objectively present. Mm-hmm. The objectively present could be really seen in terms of another kind of example, which would be the objectively present, the way that both Descartes does it as well as Lukács. Lukács is dealing in this domain. These are ontic domains for him. When I said earlier, that one of the ongoing theses of Stanley vis-a-vis the Adorno reading was that Lukács only deals with the dialectics of the social. Heidegger would have a similar kind of take on him, that it's only the ontic that he's dealing with because he's only dealing with the things objectively present. Those things objectively present to hand, right? And not the ready to hand. Okay? So, yeah. All right, so I hope this is understood. And this is, all, again, presupposed as world, and he goes through world as many levels. The surrounding, the encompassing is another way of looking at this. I like the phrase encompassing. She uses surrounding, but encompassing even gives you a greater notion of world, right? And I think more of that German tradition. So anyway, we'll keep this in mind as we go forward, but this is actually part of where he's going to go towards things. If you go back to the diagram, again, here in the existential analytic, he's building towards here the next move after world and worlding is towards the being in the world, right? And again, the being in being crucial. So he's going to make the move here, and you'll see on your diagram, to go back to this once again. And I think I have it with me today. Maybe I didn't bring it. I don't think I brought it, but yeah, maybe I have it here. Yeah. That we're leading towards the attunement, right, and other moments of the other moments of the being in the world, right? And the attunement, again, is going to be very important as we go forward in terms of these structures. Okay? I want you to keep in mind, I want to say this once again, too. I don't know why I don't have it with me. I want you to keep in mind that these are structures he's looking at, right? These are structures. It's not just the individual Dasein, but it's structures of being as Dasein. Okay? And only through us are we going to have this. So anyway, so the existential analytic, again, being very, very important here. And yes, so we're going to be moving into the world of attunement, understanding, and speech. So maybe next week we'll have the chance to, and I'll take a look at this before we leave. We can move into the reading about language, which is very profound in Heidegger's sense, where the hermeneutic comes out of. So we're going to have attunement as one aspect of the Befindlichkeit. Understanding, what does he mean by this? What does it mean to understand? And then finally, how this gets into the speech, to the Sprach, and the Sprachen, right? So we're gonna be going there, and then the other thing of the being in the world, right, is the question of thrownness. That we're all thrown into the world, the Geworftheit, and project. How are we gonna build our projects in this thrownness, right? So let's see if I have that other section. I thought I did, but I may have left it at home. Okay. So anyway.
The chart?
Yeah, I was just going to look at the chart. I'm just looking for, it's in one of these folders. I got all kinds of little maps here, and I just, for some reason, I can't
Idle
find
talk.
them. Yeah. You're going to go into idle talk and these kind of matters as well. Yeah, got Eddie, yeah. Idle talk, which will lead us also to the dictatorship of the day, and apropos the discussion by Adorno today, or on Adorno today, I found it. Again, as you can see, we're in world here, as existentialia, and this is constituting Dasein. Constituting Dasein. You want to use that, or?
That's nice.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I can steal you some. That's all I get out of the union. Anyway, so you can see world is divided really basically into the three parts, on the chart again, that you have the Zoomhanden, the Zoomhanden ready to hand, very important, that ultimately will become, as you see, as the traits of the existentialia, the structure, right, will become equipment. An equipment primordial, right? Ready to hand, relational thing, right? Relations between things and the things themselves, as well as Dasein's relation to these, right? The Vorhanden, in which you begin to see as objective, this is where the destruction is taking place, that you're going to uncover, right? These things that are present to hand in the now time, right? That which appears objectively present. So there's going to be a destruction of that, a phenomenological destruction as we go forward, right? Okay, and then the third category of this world is others. So that's where we're moving now into the being in a world and being with others, okay? And in this world with others, you begin to see the structure of care, even though we haven't read that section yet. Care will be behind this, presupposed. So you have world, care, right? Working together. The care then will be with attunement that leads into the thrownness and fracticity. And then we have also being in the world in terms of the levels of sight that I gave you already. And this is important too, is again standpoint philosophy that we were talking about earlier with Adorno. This notion of circumspection, right, in terms of sight, and ambiguity and curiosity, and the uses of the verbs that for sight I did with you, remember, right? That this is also very important to get outside of standpoint philosophy that Adorno is critiquing. All right, so we're going to begin to talk also about direction and directionality, although you get that today in the World chapter on Descartes. If you remember, he talks about inner-worldly and at the same time directionality. Right? De-distancing and directionality are two of the crucial concepts around this. Yes,
well, I'll bring it up maybe when
yeah,
we
yeah,
go
no,
over
it's
that,
okay.
but I thought
Whatever.
That was very, to me, that was very incredibly profound when he said,
right.
I think we're in 103.
So, but this is where we are. I just want everybody to realize we're speaking specifically inside the existential analytic. And again, I want to emphasize that this is the only part of Being in Time as announced project that Heidegger fulfills in this book. As I have said before, just to keep this, the Aristotle, the plan of the Aristotelian concept of time, and the reading of the physics takes place in 1927, the same year in the basic problems of phenomenology class. The question of Kant and the problem of metaphysics, 1929, and of course that's the same year he has the debate with Ernst Cassirer and Davos, in which is a very violent encounter between the two. I mean, in terms of polemics, etc. And we'll go over that as we go further. But that's the fulfilling of the project goes that way. And then Time and Being is the final part. That's not until 1962.
Is that published as a separate essay?
Yes, it's separated. So, and that's where we get the notion of the event.
Sure.
This is where the event, the rightness, which is the moment of appropriation, of which Badiou and others, and Foucault too. Foucault in Archaeology of Knowledge, very long sections on event and eventual, and Badiou, of course, his first volume of his ontology being an event comes somewhat out of this, very different than Heidegger. I mean, but let's read Heidegger and then we can look at the differences, going forward. I don't want to confuse matters too much, and sometimes it's even confusing to those of us who have read it multiple times. So, okay, what were we going to say?
Oh, maybe I'll just wait until we go through that passage, so it makes more sense.
Okay.
I didn't want to jump.
All right. So So anyway, remember, we've done 1 through 8, the introduction, the method, raising the questions, and especially the major question is the meaning of being, right? Not only the forgetting, and also the phenomenal destruction of the history of ontology, the destruction of the history of ontology. And of course, the separation, as most of you, that were here, the separation between the ontological and the ontic that he's doing constantly, right? The replacement of the Kantian categories by the existentials, etc. So this is all happening, where we are now. So anyway, so we have world as environment, we have the surrounding, the encompassing. Then in 17 he'll do reference and signs, section 17, and this is review. We did a lot of this last week. And then relevance and significance of the world, right? And this is where referential meaning as well as elementary signs are first articulated by Heidegger vis-a-vis world and worlding, right? We need to have this beforehand. We need a referential system in world first before we start identifying things. Yeah. And That's going on. So section B, we talked about, we began with Descartes last week, and the more I reread some Descartes over the week, especially the discourse on the method. I mean, this is a monster thinking, but what Heidegger's trying to do here, again, is show this is the dominant mode of our thinking today, right? This is where it starts. And again, another crucial concept, I didn't put up all the let's see what else we had. Remember the letting be for last week? We're letting the things be as they are. Remember that? I mean,
Freedom,
that you
yeah.
really have to have this letting be. This is the notion of freedom in Heidegger, to free up the things as they are, for the matter of that they are. Cannot really dominate. And this is against the Cartesian model. Okay, so why don't we begin today with, unless there are any questions or any thoughts, I thought maybe the best place to begin is the interpretation of the world and spatiality in Descartes. And I'm fine with you having some questions or thoughts about this, but this is where we have to begin to really understand this, because this is the phenomenological destruction of the ontic that he is doing with Descartes. Okay, so he has his method here is a destruction of the Descartes, but positive destruction. It's not like he's just laying it to waste. He's opening it up, and again, this German word destruction has a positive connotation to it. It's not like us, when we say it's destructive or destructive character or these kind of notions. Destruction means you're basically destroying in order to construct something new, right? And this is the way he's proceeding with the Descartes. So let's look at page 87 then. I mean, this is probably the best place. This is section B. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Section B of part 3 of part 1. Right?
Which paragraph?
This is the paragraph. It begins the contrast between our analysis of worldliness and Descartes' interpretation of world. Okay, so this section from B onward to the end is really a long dialogue with Descartes. To preface the moment, right, in the text. Okay, so he says Descartes sees the fundamental ontological determination of the world as extensio, as extension. And as you remember, I put up the two types, the res extensa as maybe part of what you can think of as world, as Vorhanden, as Vorhanden, as the objective, right? And also contained within the extensive world is the Zoomhanden, which is Heidegger's category. Again, what Descartes does not really engage is the use aspect of the ready to hand. The present to hand, Descartes is going to engage in terms of the extensor. Okay? Since extension is a component of spatiality, and again, we're looking here at Cartesian space and spatiality, Descartes, in fact, identical with it, and since spatiality is in some sense constitutive of the world, our discussion of the Cartesian ontology of the world offers at the same time a negative support for the positive explication of the spatiality of the surrounding world or the encompassing world and of Dasein itself. So with regard to Descartes' ontology, we'll discuss three things. It's very clear here. I mean, this is really, I think this is anything about Heidegger, two things historically, at least to my mind. One, he teaches us how to ask questions. He is a master at framing the question differently. To me, there's, no ands, ifs, or buts about this. I mean, it may be for, purposes that can become nefarious or whatever. But yeah, this is a radical questioning, at work, right? And secondly of all, as a teacher, he is always very clear about his intention and what he's going to do. He's very, very clear pedagogically about what he's going to do. Okay? So we discussed the foundations of the ontological determination, and then thirdly, the hermeneutical discussion of the Cartesian ontology of the world. Right? So he's going to go through this now. The following reflections can be grounded more in detail in the phenomenological destruction of the cogito sum. And remember earlier, I can find the piece of paper, but remember I said that for this thing, the cogito, the thinking thing, the Heidegger splits this instead of keeping it together, right? He's more interested in the I am, the sum is Dasein, right? The thinking is another part, okay? So this combination is split in half by Heidegger in order to show that it really is I am the one thinking, or it is Dasein thinking, not just the mind-body dualism, okay? So there's this kind of beginning to bring together again the res cogitans into one, but into existence itself, right? To bring it back together. This is going to be very, very important. Right. And up here as well are the two, and again, this is complicated. This goes through many, many levels, but the methodological doubt of Descartes in the Discourse on the Method in terms of a step-by-step doubt, in terms of separating the true from the false by movement of doubt, of skepticism, in terms of everything that we see, right? And of course, what deceives us the most are our senses. In the Cartesian world, we are completely deceived by our senses, etc. And we're fooled by the evil genius in the second meditation through our senses. Always he creates this figure, right? And then, of course, the hyperbolic thought, where he pushes everything to the extreme in terms of towards the discovery of I am a thing that thinks. But Heidegger says what doesn't occur both in the meditations nor in the discourse on the method is that the I am is left out. It is I and the I-ness that is thinking. And I-ness is a good, for Heidegger and for the phenomenology, the ness. What is this I? What is this I-ness that thinks? Right? The subject matter. Again, so we're going through labels. Right? As I mentioned to you, Descartes' contribution to the history of philosophy, and if you read this through a history of being, is that Descartes is the one who ushers in the era of self-consciousness. I am a thing that thinks, that can reflect on objects in the world and, actually discover an object world, but through the thinking apparatus, right? This is the beginning of the modern ecological region, right? The modern ego, the way we say I. Descartes is the first in modern philosophy, excluding Montaigne, to use I, to use the proper, the first person singular in a text. The first to use that since St. Augustine in the history of philosophy. So, this is, again, very important to keep in mind. All right.
So Heidegger says,
please.
Instead of the separation of the mind and body duality, so my mind allows me to think, says Descartes, Heidegger says, I think. So there's no division, it's just this sort
the
of...
I-ness of the thinking,
being,
yes, is being talked about, and the I is also the sum. I am.
So he overcomes the necessity for the division of the mind-body duality.
The attempt is to overcome the dualism that is created in Western, philosophy from this time. That ultimately will be grounded again with mathematics, with universalis mathesis, right? This is going to be very important to keep in mind as well, because the entire scientific project and scientific rationality is grounded in universal mathesis.
Because that's the method, the surest method for us to think according to Descartes, right? To use the
It's the only one that's certain. Only thing
The
that's
method.
certain. It reduces this outside of our subjectivity. It's the birth of subjectivity, but at the same time, this method of objectively present.
Right. And then
Yeah,
Heidegger is
think-
basically saying, actually, no,
Right.
mathematically, to do math in that way basically is the way not to think. So he's having a 400-year conversation, essentially. With
I mean, he's looking, listen, in this history of philosophy, what he's doing, remember, this is the history of being. So you're looking at the Dasein of Descartes here. So he's trying to explicate this, right? And at the same time show its shortcomings. So it's a dual movement always. So keep that in mind, because he's really looking at the Dasein of what was the being there-ness of René Descartes in 17th century, right, etc. Right, and he goes through. He'll go through this moment of how does Descartes get there, right? I mean, he's going to really build towards this. He's going to build towards how does Descartes get to this level of certainty, right? How does this found everything that we do? Yeah, right? How does this found everything we do? As I mentioned to you, the 17th century was the beginning of probability theory, as we know it today. And Descartes was very much against this because he wanted certainty in the sciences. Again, he's trying to build and
probability is the approximation.
Yes, and the stakes for Heidegger, looking at Descartes this way again, is to show how a foundational ontology is established. You remember the distinctions we made earlier between foundational and fundamental. So what Heidegger is trying to do, again, working through on these multiple levels, right? He's trying to, again, shake and destroy with the foundation, but also show how it was built, right? This is what he's doing, and what world was there at that moment that did this, and how world and Dasein, and ontology can overcome this. What were the determinations in, he asked the question, what were the determinations in Descartes' thinking that created this kind of, phenomenology, ontic foundation? So let's go through this. I think it'd be good to read as well, because he also takes on figure ground here. I mean, he understands this very well. First of all, Descartes distinguishes the ego cogito as the res cogiton from the res corporea. From then on, this distinction ontological defines the distinction of nature and spirit. So it's interesting, right? That res cogiton, right, defines the distinction of nature and spirit. The cogito as res cogiton, the thinking thing, versus the bodily thing. Excuse me. Although this opposition between nature and spirit is formulated ontically in many variations of content, the unclarity of its ontological fundamentals and even of the poles this opposition itself have their proximate roots in Descartes' distinction. So this is the starting point, if you will, in order to undo, right, this foundational ontic determination, right? And I mean ontic foundation as well as the determinations included. In what kind of understanding of being, and remember, Heidegger doesn't say how did Descartes come about this. He says in what understanding of being, remember, again, the Dasein of René Descartes. Again, reading this as being, as Descartes as a being in the world. Yeah, I'm trying to, so that you don't get confused. He's speaking about the Daseinness and the disclosedness, if you will, of René Descartes' position, right? And his world, if you will. Yeah, his world. Okay, so in what kind of understanding of being, right, did he determine the being of these beings, right? The term for the being of beings themselves is substantia. And remember, I put on the board, I don't think I have, yeah, I do have it here. I mean, well, I don't have the diagram, but I did the thing about substance versus existentialia, and you can see too that you'll see substance on the chart as you go out through thing and world all the way out to reality and substantiality. So again, the phenomenologist is interested in what the substance is, but wants to get deeper in terms of a penetration to the thing themselves, right? Deeper in terms of the a priori experiential nature of the things themselves, rather than leaving it at substance, right? So this expression sometimes means the being of beings as substance, substantiality, sometimes the beings themselves in a particular substance. This ambiguity of substantia is already inherent in the ancient concept of ousia, is not accidental. So again, I'm sorry, I kind of have to do this. In between this paragraph, he's also speaking about a category in the history of philosophy, such as substance, that begins with Aristotle all the way up to Descartes. So we're dealing with 2,000 years of philosophy and how the Cartesian objectivity, or the Cartesian reason, is going to try to overcome the Aristotelian reason. So he's reading at all these levels. So just to give you an example, we could spend, look, if we're really hermeneutes in the Straussian sense, not in the, we don't want to be the Straussian sense, but we could spend, just on this paragraph here, we could spend 2-3 hours, unpacking, all the things that are going on. Just to give you a kind of example of the density of this text and how much is really here, what's layered in it, and how much it needs to be delayered. Okay, but for our purposes, it's really better just to understand what his attack and his destruction's about. But remember, substance is a category that begins in Aristotle. It's not in Plato, but Aristotle uses ousia as substance. This is the way it looks. And by the way, those of you that read Derrida, ousia and gramme. He's got an essay on substance and the written, right? So ousia, this is how it looks in English from the Greek, right? Ousia, okay? Which literally means substance. And Jeremy Glick knows there's a journal called Substance.
And there's
and Boundary.
And there's an
Yes.
essay called ousia and gramme.
Yeah, it's in Margins of Philosophy.
Is that C or an O?
Oh, it's OU.
Oh.
OU, I'm sorry. Ousia. Yeah. And parousia was used in the Christian vocabulary next to the substance. God. In some way. Or presence, too. You also have presence in a kind of ousia, too. So parousia is another notion of this that we can talk about later. But anyway, okay, so the ontological determination of the res corporea requires the explication of substance. That is, the substantiality of these beings as particular substances. And what constitutes, and we read some of this last week, but I thought it would be important to go over this. I'm not going to read the Latin again, but let's just see. Substances are accessible through their attributes. And every substance has an eminent property in terms of which the essence of the substantiality of a definite substance can be determined. So all the attributes, right, are basically, go back to the substance itself. What is the property with regard to the res corporea? Extension in terms of length, and you begin to see measurement here, right? Length, breadth, and depth constitutes the real being of what the corporeal substance that we called world. So the world at this time, basically, is length, breadth, and depth, right? 3 dimensions, right? 3-dimensional space, if you will, right? What gives the extensia of this distinction? Extension is the constitution of being of the beings under discussion, a constitution which must already be before any other determinations of being in order for the latter to be able to be what they are. Extension must be primarily attributed to the corporeal thing. Accordingly, the proof for the extension of substantiality of the world characterized by that extension is accomplishment by showing how all the other properties of this substance, above all division, figure, motion, can only be conceived as modes of extension, and that extensio conversely remains intelligible, without figure, and motion, right? So it's very, very interesting the way he begins to explicate what is in Descartes' extended thing, right? Here. And, in our layman's terms, he's really describing three-dimensionality here, right? That this is what the space of the Cartesian corporeal thing is, right? Of the corporeal thing, right? So, as the extensia, right? Thus, a corporeal being can maintain in total extension and yet change for the distribution of extension in many ways and in various dimensions, and still present itself as one and the same thing in manifold shapes, right? Gestalt is a mode of extensio and motion as well. For modus is only comprehended if we only inquire about locomotion without taking into account the force that creates it. So, Lenin wrote on force in history, Engels on force in history, right, etc. This is coming out very much out of the 17th century notions of force and motion, etc. It's re-articulated, in Newtonian force. Then later, it's of course re-articulated in the history of philosophy by Hegel in the Phenomenology in a section called Force and the Understanding. So you begin to see what Heidegger's doing here. He's setting up, again, his long trajectory, if you will, from Plato to, Hegel in terms of the history of Western metaphysics. He's trying to, keep this in mind as we read this. He's also, taking on, three-dimensional space, because at this time, fourth dimension and really even almost fifth dimension, Heidegger is going to start, speaking about, in terms of the time. Yeah, go ahead.
Later on, like around 103, 102, when he talks about spatiality and the distancing, he's going to basically say, actually, the three-dimensional space is outlined by the Cartesian science.
Yes.
Is not really the way we perceive the three-dimensionality of our own world.
Right.
We actually, when we say, I'm going to take a half-an-hour walk,
right.
I don't literally mean, 350 yards.
Right.
But the iWatch does.
Right.
Force us to do that, because the iWatch says you've only walked like 300 yards.
Working on a book, Homo Datum. Yeah. He's a Homo Datum.
It's so
here.
true, though. Heidegger is so perceptive on this.
Right,
Like,
he is. Oh, yeah. No, he's got it all down. In that context.
I don't know if this is true, but it seems to be saying we actually perceive the world in potentially dimensions other than three.
We do.
We're not limited by, that's
Yes.
a limitation.
He's always
How we
dealing
perceive
with a
time.
manifold versus that of what can be restricted to what you just called Cartesian space, of which you're very accurately saying what's happening in terms of the iPhone. You have X amount of kilometers to go.
Maybe
the restaurant is at this coordinate, etc. You
That
begin to
becomes your
think
world. That's
you
your
begin to
world.
think of geometry in this thing where the coordinates and the vectors
Diagrams.
are, and the
Life
diagrams,
is a
etc.
diagram.
Yeah.
Maybe
Well, the
that-
mathematical in terms of the diagram. Yeah.
Maybe that's why also Deleuze and others like where we studied, they introduced these languages of the manifolds, of the multiple
Yes.
sort of dimensions in 1,000 plateau. They're basically, in a certain sense, it's an attempt to extend this kind of critique
It is.
of Cartesian.
Yes, no, again, this is a fundamental text in terms of eliciting all these kind of approaches from 1,000 plateaus to the multitude in Negre and Hart to, all of these things are coming out of this kind of against standpoint philosophy, against fixed points in philosophy, fixed dogmatic presuppositions that are working, right, etc., without an examination of those presuppositions. Also, this concept of world, that world worlds instead of, which is a verb, right, rather than it's just the world, right, the way we talk, right, it's always worlding world, and worlding world is just not Earth. Earth is part of Earth worlding world, right, but, we're also dealing with space, interstices, all of these interstices of space and time in this regard. What he's really trying to do, again, I think, is destroy phenomenologically, again, positively, and whether he does this or not, is worthy of, very high level argumentation, but he is trying to get rid of this Cartesian space, right, in order to make way and also show that and as our friend Son Ross says, space is the place, right? that really he wants to go to this topos, right, and this topological view of worlding world, right, instead of the Zeitraum, the time-space continuum and time-space arrangements that we have had since Aristotle through Kant and through Hegel. If that makes sense,
So
somewhat.
topos means
Topos is in
means
Greek is place.
Place.
Topological. We're
So
trying to do.
topology. So when mathematicians say topology, what do they mean? They don't mean, I guess, the study of space and how space is.
Place.
How place
Place
is.
in the equation, and place in the matrix, place in the arrangement, all of these kinds
Because
of
I
things.
was thinking about this, and I think topology in math is sort of like the ability to describe places that have no discontinuities, right? So like if you
Right.
run your finger along a circle, three-dimensional
Yes, that's
sphere,
one do.
you can't
Yeah.
leave the surface unless you, so that's a topological surface, right?
Right.
But in here it means place in the philosophy.
For Heidegger,
Greeks.
he's using the Greek word, and he's going to shift from topos. He's going to go from what in German is Raum, right, and Zeitraum, time-space relationships. He wants to go back to the ancient Greek to do topology, right? To do a
Space and
typology,
place.
right? That we have forgotten place, right? And and the forgetfulness has been because of the Cartesian spacing, if you will, right? Or space becoming dominant in the Cartesian project, which is still with us. I mean, the whole medical complex is built on Cartesian, system. Everything that we do, I mean, almost everything is still within that, despite all our attempts to go beyond this dualism. Right? Yeah, please, yeah.
Does string theory have anything to do with, the multiple?
Well, he's certainly
ideas of
thinking of that
place,
dimension. I don't think string
dimensions.
theory was really out there when
No.
Heidegger was
I'm
writing
wondering
this.
if this
But, I mean,
contributed to
yeah.
string theory, maybe.
Yeah, very possibly. Yeah. But again, you have to remember the ontological now, in terms of the fundamental ontology, is now a new system of fundaments, not foundational in terms of the sciences. So Heidegger is always looking at the role of science does, but does not think, right? Science is always in the subjectively present thing. So for him, a string theory would have to be thought, again, as, one of the fundaments that are, part of the world of that, right? Yeah. So he's not, he has an antagonistic relationship. I don't think it's hostile, but it's antagonistic in the sense that he's not interested in that the science does not think, right? Science does not think. Science does not think about its own presuppositions. It does not think about its, its project, so to speak, right? The way that a fundamental ontology or being and being in the world would do. Right? So science is basically an ontic and a system of ontic variations in this. And again, remember I said, even in Descartes this early, but again, Heidegger is arguing against metaphysics in the name of fundamental ontology, right? If you can keep these separations in your mind, I mean, these are separations. It's not a dualism, it's a separation he's doing for a reason. That the Cartesian, moment, right, is much more on the level of metaphysics. Descartes says, the trunk is physics, right? This is invented during our time. Althusser will do the history of philosophy. He does 3 steps, right, in terms of philosophy, right? In the beginning, you had mathematics, Thales. And then, of course, Plato tries to work all this out. This is out of which Badiou, will begin his mathematical ontology in a certain way, right? So Thales is the first philosopher, and it's the philosopher of mathematics. And from that, we get Plato and Aristotle's meditations on mathematics. That's what the Greek world really leaves us philosophically. The second moment is physics, right? And that's in the 17th century, corpuscular physics, right? The Copernican turn, etc., leading up to Newtonian space. And Descartes is the philosopher, of the Galilean moment, of the Galilean physics moment, right? And then for Althusser, the third science is history, and that's Marx. Marx opens up this next new continent called the science of history. Heidegger will say, no, there's something behind history too. He would argue with that. That's still within, right? A kind of ontic thing. Well, we're going to get to this later, and we'll have this discussion, which is interesting. But Heidegger will say, no, there's still this, epochal, history, and what we could call, again, the topos that we have to read, in terms of the history of philosophy. So you're reading, you're reading in multiple layers. You're always reading the being of an epoch, right? And as I told you, the Greek world is the one and the many. So the many that we talk about today, the multiple of where Deleuze and Guattari, as you mentioned, Deleuze wants to begin with the many back to the one. We're going to begin always with the multitude or the many, right? In this way. Parmenides wants to begin with the one and then the many, and this has been a long debate in the history of philosophy, but this goes back to the Greek world, the being of the one. What is the one? Ton. Yeah? Ton. The being of the one. And then, in the medieval times, this shifts in the Roman period all the way up until the 17th century, the being of nature. Nature, and then Spinoza fulfills that with natura naturen, that God is nature naturing. It's not God or nature in Spinoza, really, as many people have said. It's really nature naturing. It's God as nature, right? In a sense, for God or if you will, again, the notion of ultimate substance, ultimate reality, etc., figures as geometry in Descartes, right? Is a geometer, figures as nature naturing in Spinoza, and of course as the clock in Newton, right? So this is, and as you know, the time of political economy is Constantine Huygens' clock time, invents in 1657, of which we still keep time on, capitalist time. This is capitalist diabolic time when you look at your watch, you can, right? Now So anyway, but this is all coming out of the scientific project of the 16th and 17th centuries, right? Particularly. So you're always reading that. So what happens with Descartes, again, the new epoch of self-consciousness. So you're reading this epoch, right? At the same time, he's looking at what is the design of this cogito, this advent of self-consciousness. I am a thinking thing, He's aware of this in his moment of extreme or hyperbolic doubt. And what is the existence of this thinking? Right? The I am. Well, how did we get to the existential, probably better put in Heideggerian language? How do we get to this existential, right? Instead of just the category of I think, or the cogito, right? So he's beginning with the existential alongside of the... It is overwhelming.
Incredible.
Yeah. Well, it is. It should be flooring you. Yeah, I mean, yeah. Jeremy's got to go to the bathroom. Anyway, yeah. But anyway, you don't need the key. I think it's open. But yeah, down the hall to your left. Anyway, but yeah. But do you? I mean, look. If you can try to read, I think you're going to get much more out of it. Me, as kind of having read it and practiced a little bit of it, that if you read it at these levels, it's going to make more sense to you. That he's operating always on three registers at least. There's a phenomenological destruction of the ontology, right? Right? There's always this kind of method in this movement going forward in terms of, where is Dasein? Always. That's this existential analytic. What are these structures that we're looking at, right? So it's a diagnostic, right? Right, etc. Right, and in this point, and then it's going to become a prognostic, in the sense of not only the history of being, but also a prognostic in terms of, maybe we have to look at another underlying structure, such as care, right? Another underlying, structure. And we're going to look at care as terms of being in. Why do we interpret the world? We have to care for it. You have to maybe ask these questions. Why interpretation? Attunement. Why circumspection? Why do we have, speech? Why does he go into the questions of idle talk versus, fullness of speech? Lacan has a very good essay in psychoanalysis about full and empty speech in the psychoanalytic or in the therapeutic situation. I know that, doctor. Disavowal is part of empty speech. I know, but I still do the same thing. That's disavowal versus denial. I just push it down and won't deal with it, right? In some ways. And then the full speech is more of I own it. I take it upon myself. We will talk about this when we get to language, but that's another level of this, and why it's such, at least to my mind, one of the most profound, books of the 20th, century, and why people flock to these courses. Yeah, this was the one. Okay, so let's go back. So you can see again, we have all these levels going on, and so let's see if I can cut to the chase a little bit here with Descartes here. We talked about Gestalt and force, right? And then he did this thing, and we read this last week, Hardness and Resistance. Do you remember this? And this is Nietzsche plays on this, and why so hard, said the charcoal to the diamond, and then the diamond replies, "Why so soft?" Right? And this is a very interesting moment of Nietzsche rewriting, hardness and resistance here in Descartes, right? So he goes through this, which is interesting. The being of is all divisible, figurable, and mobile, and it can change in every kind of. This is page 90, right before the beginning of section 20, Chris. Thus, what constitutes the being of res corporea is extensio, right? Okay, so this is the crucial concept that you want, extensio, and that is the all world divisible, figurable, and mobile. All the worlds, So world here is both divisible, figurable, and mobile, and it can change in every kind of divisibility, shape, and motion. And what persists throughout all these change remain. In a corporeal being, what is capable of such a remaining constant is what genuinely that being, indeed, it is in such a way that it characterizes the substantiality of this substance. So he's basically going through what keeps this as a constant concept, right? Such as substance, right? Through this res extensio. How is this guaranteed in Descartes? How does he make this happen? All right, so the next one is the fundaments of the ontological definition of world, and he goes through many levels here. And the Christian world is being taken on. The end's creation, right? The creatum, right? As well as God and the creatures, creating the creatures as well, right? So if you look down on the page 91, the fundaments of the ontological definition, following Aristotle, and this is section 20, Chris, second paragraph, about 12 lines down, following Aristotle, in whom the problem is prefigured as it is the point of departure for Greek ontology in general, various kinds of analogies were established according which to the schools differ in their interpretation of the functional significance of being. With regard to the ontological development of the problem, Descartes is far behind the scholastic. He evades the problem. So you can see, and was Deo et creaturis, excuse me, creaturis sit communicus, right? And this is about no significance of this substance which would be common to God and his creation can be distinctly understood. This evasion means that Descartes leaves the meaning of being contained in the idea of substantiality and the character of the universality of the meaning unexplained, right? So, okay. Medieval ontology left the question of what being itself means just as unquestioned as did ancient ontology. So we're going back somewhat here in this section on Descartes and world, right? Back to the original problematic that he elucidates in sections 1 through 8. We have forgotten the question of being. I'm raising it again through this reading of the history of philosophy, but what we really meant is the meaning of being. And Descartes does not get to this as a universal. He keeps it at the level of the, substance, right? But does not go further. And the medievalists do neither, right? What being means. So Descartes, following up, not only evades the ontological question of substantiality, he emphasized explicitly that substance is such, that is, its substantiality is in for itself inaccessible from the very beginning. We cannot get there. And, I told you that, for Descartes, when he said, we cannot know God, how he comes to an idea of God, right? That the idea of perfection somehow comes to him after the cogito is established, right? And he says, well, where the hell did this idea of perfection come from? Because I'm not perfect. So there was an external cause that must have put it in him. God, right? And this is the beginning of the insurance policy against the church during this period, because they burned philosophers at the stake, as you know, right? And there was an inquisition going on. So in some ways, Descartes, some people have argued that Descartes really covering himself by coming up with this idea. Deferring as the external, that the idea of perfection, if you have an idea, it's got to be coming from inside, right, in some ways, which is an idealist predication, but he's looking at cause, right? Sui, causal, what is it caused of its own kind, or is it caused from the outside?
Is he religious himself? Or?
Not as a practicing person, but he was hung out with many people of the church. And Father Mersenne was his most, it's a fascinating correspondence. He had a correspondence with Hobbes, too. By the way, Thomas Hobbes, the objections and replies to the Meditations, and Father Mersenne was his major interlocutor who was in the church, who was known as and Malebranche was the other one of that period. The materialists during the period, very interesting, but not taught at all and not really commented upon it, but he actually engages the concept of substance, is Pierre Gassendi. And very little has been written on Gassendi, but Gassendi was read actively by Spinoza. So you have a trace from Gassendi, Spinoza read Descartes, had a left Cartesian circle in Amsterdam, and in this left Cartesian circle, he wrote a book called The Principles of Descartes' Philosophy, Spinoza. This is in about 1660s, right? And he also was reading Pierre Gassendi, the materialist, too, at this time, before he started to work on the ethics. So it's a very interesting period, the 17th century, and I think some serious studies, anybody interested could really do an excellent materialistic, Negrete sort of paved the way with political Descartes, but nobody's really followed this up in the 17th century. Everything's too much about contemporary figures. Everybody wants to write on Althusser, Badiou, Rancière, et cetera, Stiegler, et cetera. But this would be a really great, hermeneutic to do, because it's a century we still pretty much live in. We still are very immersed in probability theory. A lot of the chaos theory comes out of this that we talk about. We still have, this mind-body division that we enact constantly. We act this way in the world always. So anyway, let me go on. Okay, so he evades the question, and therefore being does not affect us, therefore it cannot be perceived. So he's saying that Descartes himself completely avoids, this is section 94 of section 20, or page 94, 92 in the text, 94 in the margins, which I guess is the old text for them in terms of pagination. Okay, or maybe Stambau's earlier, 94, I think. Okay, so being is not a real predicate, and I know I read this last week, according to Kant. It's not a real predicate. So there's no predication of being, and thus the possibility of a pure problematic of being is renounced in principle, and a way out is sought for arriving at the definition of substances designated above. Because being is in fact not accessible as a being, it is expressed by existing definite qualities of the being in question, that is by attributes, not by existentials or by structures, right? By attributes, right? Not, however, by arbitrary qualities, but by those most purely satisfy the meaning of being and substantially, tacitly presupposed. Extensia is a primarily necessary attribute in the finite substance as, bodily thing, as res corporea. Right? And he goes on to cite Descartes. I won't read this, but anyway, basically, it is moreover easier to know a substance that thinks or an extended substance, that's Descartes speaking, than substance alone. Right?
That's how he avoids it. He
Yes,
doesn't talk
right.
about the substance alone.
Without regarding whether it thinks or is it extended. Right? So again, if you keep in mind with Descartes, and this res extensa, right? Extensia, always this thing, right? The object world, the objective world ultimately, that is very much connected to the Vorhanden, right? Of the objectively present world to Descartes, right? This is where the subject-object comes in, right? And then the res cogito, right? The thinking thing, right? Of which Heidegger says the I am is dealt with only separately, but not part of the thinking being, right? It's only the thing that thinks, right, is here. So you have the thinking thing in the res extensia, which is the beginning of the mind-body dualism that starts the advent of modern philosophy, or what we call subjectivity. Anyways, this is the beginning of subjectivity. And when we begin to use the first person, pronoun I. I am a thing that thinks, right? But we forget the am. That's what Heidegger keeps mentioning. That's where the existentialia is. We forget the am. Okay. This was the complaint of Kierkegaard against Hegel. Figured out everything, but he left man out of the system. Right? This is what Kierkegaard said, kind of repeating. Yeah. So anyway, so you hopefully beginning to understand that the stake here in terms of world and Dasein is to overcome modern subjectivism, right? The domination of the subject over the object. The domination of nature, if you will, too. The domination of nature and spirit. Right? He's speaking to these levels. That this is somehow what this cogito and this substantia does. Right? All right. So let's go on. Okay. So at the bottom, at the end of 20, what is intended as substantiality is understood in terms of an existence quality of substance, because something ontic is made to underlie the ontological. The expression substantia functions sometimes in an ontological, but sometimes in an ontic meaning, but mostly in a meaning which shifts about in a hazy mixture of the two. This is page 93 at the top. But behind this slight difference of meaning lies the failure to master the fundamental problem of being. Its development requires tracking down the equivocations in the right way. So, of course, Heidegger is going to show us the path, right? Whoever tries this sort of thing is not occupied with mere verbal meanings, but must venture forth to the most primordial, again, a crucial word for him, primordial, problematic of the things themselves. Again, the battle cry of phenomenology, we're going to get to the things themselves, to get such nuances straightened out, right? So this is actually setting up, quote, the problem for the hermeneutical discussion that will follow. How do we get to the, beyond the mere verbal meanings, okay? So, if you look down at the end of the critical question now arises, does this ontology of the world see the phenomena of world at all? Does it actually even see it? Is Descartes blind, right? And if not, does it at least define inner worldly being to the extent that their worldly character can be made visible? To both questions, we must answer no. You can hear them. Nine. The being which Descartes is trying to grasp, ontologically and in principle with the extensio, is rather of such a nature that it can be discovered initially only through an inner worldly being initially at hand. Again, the Vorhanden, at hand, right? Ready to hand. But if this, along with the ontological characteristic of this particularly interworldly being, nature, the idea of substantiality, as well as the meaning of existit and ad existendum contained in its definition, lead to obscurity, the possibility nonetheless still exists through an ontology that is grounded in the radical separation of God, ego, and world, this triad. The ontological problem of world is in some sense raised and further advanced, right? Again, we're going to stay with this section called world and worlding. But even if this possibility does not exist, we must show explicitly that Descartes not only goes amiss ontologically in his definition of world, and by the way, Descartes did write a treatise called Le Monde that he suppressed. Let me put this on the board. It was part of the original. He wrote 3 texts that were being published simultaneously: the Discourse on the Method, and the Method of rightly conducting one's I won't write the whole thing out. Of rightly conducting one's reason in the sciences. Okay, this was composed 1618 to 1629. The other part of this was the the optics, right? And the final one was Le Monde on the world. And the world itself he suppressed because of what happened to Galileo. Yeah.
We don't know what it.
No, we have it. We have it. No, I have it. There are 11 volumes of his collected works. I have it. It's very nice. And they do the script. A friend of mine bought it many years ago for me. Very, very nice gift. The entire collection of Descartes in 11 volumes. He wrote on music. Some very interesting things on music. Yeah. Passions of the soul. Well, this was a thinker. Again, it's a thinker engaging a thinker here, which is, part of our task, is to see, it's not only a dismissal, it's not a joke about it, this is thinking and engaging a particular kind of thought, and probably the highest thought, up until, in my view, until Hegel, tries to overcome the subject-object dichotomy by, reducing the phenomena, pneuma.
Did he engage with
distinction.
Heidegger?
Yes. He did a seminar on the structure of experience, Hegel's concept of experience, and yes, he mentions Hegel throughout. Never really a systematic engagement with Hegel like he did. His philosophers in terms of engagement were Aristotle, obviously, Plato and Plato's theory of the truth, the ancients, the pre-Socratics, right? He did some stuff on the medievalists, some of the medieval logicians, a little bit on Aquinas, of course. And then, multiple texts on Descartes, if you want to follow this through the Age of the World view, and the Age of the World picture, the world picture, and or world image. I think he uses build in German, right? Is that right? And he uses
that's Richard Dean's.
Yeah, Richard Dean's likes that. Yeah. And then, of course, the essence of technology, of which, Descartes has played a very active role in that. So there's an engagement. And then Kant, of course, is the main interlocutor in terms of modern philosophy, right? and then Hegel on experience. Letter on Humanism, that brief aside on Marx. Very little, nothing on Marx really, except for that, and the conversations with Axelos. You could imagine the encounter, and this is taking place, again, Jean-Marie Vincent, French Marxist, did some work on the left Heideggerian, Enzo Paci, a phenomenologist who had some Heideggerianness with him, and now they have movements in Italy like hermeneutical communism. Vattimo, Johnny Vattimo, talks about hermeneutical communism.
We're also wondering, we're talking with Nori about his correspondence with the Japanese Marxist Nishida Kitaro, on nothingness.
Yes, he had that was going on as well.
With
Yes,
a,
yes.
Major Marxist thinker in Asia.
Yeah, no, very, very interesting that he had that conversation going on as well. Yeah. But again, I hope, my hope for you, in a sense, and that we're doing this, is you try to get underneath it, in a sense, that it's really thinking with thinkers, right, together. It's really happening, and that's why I'm trying to, talk a little bit more about, some of these philosophers out here, such as Descartes, who wants to build the method, towards certainty, right? He spends 11 years with this. He doesn't publish it until 1633, right? But he starts on it when he's 24 years old, and a lot of it's written in Amsterdam. So, this is the beginning of the method, right? In which he speaks of the domination of nature. Descartes really thought that philosophy was medicine. He basically thought that he was really going to heal mankind. That it was really this, and he really saw himself in that role, right? That he was figuring out everything. And, this is one of the reasons a lot of neurologists read him. They think that there's a lot of brain stuff. Damasio is one of the people, who reads Descartes, Antonio Damasio, who does work on neurology and, the frontier of neurolinguistics. These kind of things, and so, and again, this figure is so important. We do a lot of French philosophy. This is French philosophy. He's the originator. He is the thinker of the French. So Heidegger's not taking on just a small fish here. He's taking on the master of modernity, that who is associated with the advent of modern subjectivity, the advent of philosophical modernity, and someone who's had two major contributions to the history of philosophy. The birth of the ecological realm, or the birth of, the self, if you will. If you wanted to be Foucault, do a genealogy of it, it's the Cartesian, which to Nietzsche, if you read Nietzsche's Will to Power and some of the fragments, the Cartesian moment is a fiction, but anyway, and then of course the object world, that he is thinking through this world, this object world, in a very, very deep way, but according to Heidegger, mostly through substance, right? And the category of substantiality, not as an ontological problem, that he cannot get to the ontological, get to the level of the being of the substance. So the being here is done in three-dimensional space. This is Cartesian space, right? And he goes through the length, the breadth, and, the categories that he comes up with, the measurement, right? And then he's going to now talk about how we hermeneutically gain access to this, right? How do we gain access to this world, right? So how do we get to this worldliness, right? We want to get proper access, he says in section 21. In our exposition of the problem of worldliness, we refer to the importance of gaining proper access to the phenomena. Thus, in our critical discussion, of the Cartesian point of departure, we must ask what kind of being of design we should fix upon. What kind of being of design we should fix upon is the approximate kind of access to that being, with whose being as extensio Descartes equates with the being of the world. Right? How does this being, become extensio, become the being of the world? Right? Right? The sole genuine access to the being is knowing, intellectio. in the sense of the kind of knowledge we get in mathematics and physics. So you can see what Heidegger's doing here too. He takes a Latinate like intellectio, and he talks about this as specific to mathematics and physics. This is where intelligence is. Right? Okay. Right? Mathematical knowledge is regarded as the one way of apprehending beings which can always be certain of the secure possession of the being of beings which it apprehends. Mathematics is certain and evident. Descartes will talk about in the discourse on the method. Whatever has this kind of being adequate to the being accessible in mathematical knowledge is in the true sense. This being is what is always is what it is, and that which can be shown to have the character of constantly remaining as the remnants capax mutation constitutes the true being of beings which can be experienced in the world. That's Descartes speaking, right? This is Heidegger explicating. What enduringly remains truly is. This is the sort of thing that mathematics knows, what intelligence knows. Heidegger does not consider intelligence as the supreme, category. When you say someone's smart, to Heidegger, that's so what? Right? Or, intelligence. This is, okay? So remember this. This is a byproduct, if you will, of mathematical and physics training, right? Self-evident reasoning, and is a part of the Latinates that have built from this world of nature to self-consciousness. Okay? Okay? So, right? The being of the world is, so to speak, dictated to in terms of a definite idea of being, which is embedded, again, in the concept of substantiality.
And then you think about artificial intelligence, right? And
it's all
a
there.
perfectly consistent term, because
Yes.
if it comes from, mathematics, computer science, it's not a.
It's a good point.
So we can't
Good
criticize
point.
it directly.
In terms of a material
it's a
etymology, you have a good
consistent
chapter
terminology,
there. Yes, that's right. I think so. Yeah. No, I'm serious. Yeah. Seriously. Yeah, you do. Yeah, in a certain way. The material etymology would yield that kind of thing. How do you get to this level of artificial, and really artificial comes from artifactual,
Yeah.
It was made, there was an art of making it, right? But artificial is a much more superficial way of making, right? And, the making of the intelligence, and what is this intellectia, what is this computer science and all these calculations, they're coming out of, right, this Cartesian world of substance.
But
and
before reading
substantiality.
Heidegger, I used to make fun of AI. I was like, of
Oh,
course
no,
it's not
no.
intelligent,
No.
but of course actually that the term is correct from the point of view of the scientist.
No accident, they have Descartes logistics.
Yeah.
Very good stock in Ontario. Waterloo, Ontario. Descartes logistics. Yeah.
Well, it's in Waterloo.
And of course, yeah.
Really?
Yeah, it's a big place for technology. Waterloo Technology, Ontario. Yeah. Anyway, all right. I'm sorry about the cold in here. I'm going to really get upset and not pay the rent today. So anyway, let's go on here too. All right. So, and I'll try to just summarize, kind of gloss over some of this. Okay. So anyway, but let's finish this paragraph. It's important. And in terms of an idea of knowledge which cognize beings in this way, Descartes does not allow the kind of being of interworldly beings to present itself, but rather prescribes to the world, right, so to speak, its true being on the basis of an idea of being. Being equals constant presence. Constant's presence, right? And we're living in this time of Constant's presence. Vis-a-vis our discussion, Nori and I had a little discussion about the constant present yesterday. You remember the now time and Mark Zuss and this kind of stuff. That this is very much again in the Cartesian model, right? And also what digitalization is doing. Everybody is in the now time, in the constant present, right? This is very, very interesting when you begin to, as Arto was doing, project this into today's world, because the great thing about a book like this, the Adorno and everything, it's nothing but contemporary. You know, even though it's 100 years gone since this, or 90 years, and in Adorno's case, 60. You know, we still, you know, we have contemporarity. Contemporaneity to deal with it all the time. Okay, the concept to the source of which has not been revealed, and the justification which is not demonstrated. Thus, it is not primarily Descartes' dependence upon a science mathematics, which just happens to be so especially esteemed. And I don't know if you've read Discourse on the Method or any of Descartes, but Descartes says, in my great background at La Flèche, which was the most influential Jesuit school in France, where he went, I held mathematics of all subjects, I held it in the highest esteem. Because it was the closest, quote, to the truth, and I loved the self-evidence and the demonstrative proof of its reasoning. So this is what, he's talking to. So this elevation here, right? All right, so, which happens to be especially esteemed, that determines his ontology of the world. Rather, and this is interesting, his ontology is determined by a basic ontological orientation towards being as constant objective presence, right? Which mathematical model is exceptionally well suited to grasp. So you see, time is before time, world, then mathematics. Right? Very interesting, right? We have the time here, right? Which mathematics is exceptionally well suited to grasp. Constant objective presence. It's
interesting, if we can almost make the argument that, when Stigler was saying that the proletariat, Marx was too early. He had anticipated the future by talking about the proletariat. We can say that today we're truly witnessing the actualization of capital's inherent possibilities, because only now we're living the world of the constant present. Like, it took 400 years to really reach, this kind of a stage. Maybe that's why we're still in Descartes' world. We're still haven't exhausted, this reason.
Well, if you think about, like a Stigler who looks at, say, the early, the ticker tape used to come out of a machine, right? And he says this is anticipating the speed of capital that you're reading, stock quotes and all this out this way. And then this became electronic in the 40s, right, in the 50s, and now today it's, on your phone, it's everywhere, right, in a sense. So this was a way of conditioning time to the constant present, right, in a sense. But this goes back to to the early 19th century and the beginning of the thing. If you know the movie, what's the one with Alain Delon, Monica Vitti, the Antiononi, The Eclipse, the one that begins at the stock, she's running into the stock exchange and they glance at each other, all that. You see the acceleration right there. That's kind of a very good filmic example of this. The Eclipse, Alain Delon and Monica Vitti. That opening scene of the exchange, right, at the exchange. So, please.
There's a well-known socialist realism painting of Lenin looking at a ticker tape in his office as it's coming out. I don't know.
I'd like to have that one.
It's
now.
great.
Can I? You know the artist?
I'm sure. Well, no.
Yeah, we're gonna look it up. I know. We're gonna go right to constant presence.
Right.
But I would love to have that. Do you know who the painter was?
No, it was just the early socialist realism. Do you know what, Arto?
Must be American, though, right? A painter? Or
I'm sorry?
Is it an American painter? It must be an American.
No, I think it was a Soviet.
Really?
I'm not sure.
Studying capital.
Yeah.
So you have many ways. See, you want to get out of standpoint thinking. Right. Okay, so let's go on. But you guys kind of see what he's up to? I mean, I know it's dense. I mean, I know it's in,
This is a great section.
Yeah. But it's very, And this is why the person, I think I told you the story of the old dapper man that would come to being in time at the New School. During the 80s, right? That would come in very dapper and sit in front, very well groomed and everything, sit off to the corner a little bit, and he'd raise his hand and go, Professor Schurman, do you mean to tell me that Professor Heidegger has solved the subject-object dichotomy of René Descartes? Preposterous. I want to say thank you, Dr. Heidegger, but no thank you. And this was his reading of this section. You know,
The level of service was-
this, you know.
What did Schumann say?
Yeah. He just, he had to go on. Yeah. back to the text.
Where are those students now?
Yeah, no, he wasn't. I don't know where. I mean, I think he was. He read the ticker tape. The way he was dressed. Anyway, yeah, the silk scarf sitting in the front. It was very fun.
Hey, man,
Thank you.
Essence must appear. There's nothing wrong with Silk Scar.
No, I didn't say anything wrong with it. I said he's not teaching.
As my brother David Hilliard says, the
Oh,
Black Panthers
okay.
didn't fight the revolution so that people can't have silk shirts. They fought the revolution. So
Nothing's
everyone
too good
can
for the
have-
representatives
everyone can
of the
have
working
silk shirts.
class. Yeah, nothing's too good for the representatives of the working class. That's right.
Representatives.
Yes, right.
Stormy Chain, the party.
You just have to be told that silk scarves are nice. Yeah, this is cotton.
Next time I go,
Anyway,
I'm gonna-
nice pattern. But
I got a guy in London.
what's that? Oh, you got a guy in London on Savile Row, on Savile Row, or on which street? Bond.
In center, like the center. I can't
Oh,
remember.
okay. You got to know the street if you're going
name
to
is
buy
Abu.
from London, Jeremy. I mean, the representatives have not taught you well enough.
I know it. I'll give you the guy.
Yeah, I don't know.
His name is Arun.
The same place that Arun goes to?
No, this guy's name is Arun.
Oh, it's Arun.
Yeah, anyway.
Oh, okay. I didn't think Arun was getting scarves from London. Yeah. He's too proletaritized. Right. Anyway. Okay. So, Anyway, so let's look at this just a little more. Okay. His ontology in mathematical is exceptionally well suited to grasp this objective present. Again, to go back to the world of Vorhanden, right? The things present at hand. This is what Descartes is doing. He is working in that world, right? According to Heidegger, the other world is not really looked at. The Zuhanden. All right. So he explicitly switches over from the development of traditional ontology, right? He goes from traditional ontology to modern mathematical physics and its transcendental foundations. Okay? This is important, again, that he is now going to switch to a foundational moment, right? Transcendental foundations from the fundamental ontology. Okay? So Descartes is the latest in a series of shifts, right? That ushers in philosophical modernity, and it is a shift of which our disciplines still suffer from. If you remember this beginning that we went through the regional works, biology, anthropology, and psychology, okay, good, all right. Descartes does not need to raise the problem of the approximate access to interworldly beings. Under the unbroken dominance of traditional ontology, the way to get a grasp of what truly is has been already decided. That lies in noin, in intuition, in the broadest sense of which dianoin, thinking, is just a derivative form. Yeah? So thinking and intuition are related, etymologically. It is in terms of this basic ontological orientation that Descartes gives his critique of the possible intuitive perceptive access to beings of sensatio, aesthesis, from which the word aesthetics comes, as opposed to intellectia. Descartes knew very well. So this is the hermeneutical interpretation at work. I want you to see this. This is why I'm reading this out loud. This is the hermeneutical moment at work, with Descartes. Descartes knows very well that beings do not initially show themselves in their true being. What is given initially is this waxen thing which is colored, flavored, hard, cold, and resonant in a definite way. But this is not important ontologically, not in general, as anything which is given through the senses. And as I said before, Descartes fundamentally says the sensory world deceives us. This is an opposition that's being created between sensatio and intellectio in Descartes' thinking. Right? We are deceived by the senses. And the evil genius is the one who deceives us through the
And
senses.
the intuition is not to be trusted. because-
Yes, exactly. Right? And Kant ultimately says intuitions are empty, and without concepts, intuitions are blind.
And
So this is a
Adorno
very long history
says
here. Yeah,
something
and Adorno
interesting.
too. Yeah. Okay, so anyway, then he goes on, it will be sufficient to us the perception of the senses, I'm reading the footnote, are related simply to the intimate union which exists between body and mind, and that while by their means we are made aware of what in external bodies can profit or hurt this union, they do not present them to us as they are in themselves, unless occasionally and accidentally. Right? So there's no, quote, unhiddenness and disclosure in the early part. The senses do not enable us to know any being in its being. They merely make known the usefulness and the harmfulness of external, inner-worldly things for human beings encumbered with bodies. And then he goes on to, again, quote, in this way we shall ascertain that the nature of matter or of body in its universal aspect does not consist in it being hard or heavy or colored or one that affects our senses in some way or another, but solely in the fact that it is a substance extended in length, breadth, and depth. Again, the three dimensionalities. Okay, if we subject Descartes' interpretation of the experience of hardness and resistance to a critical analysis, it will be plain how unable he is to let what shows itself in sensation present itself in its own kind of being, let alone determine its character, because it's being negated, right, without being disclosed. Hardness is understood as resistance, but neither hardness or resistance is understood in the phenomenal sense as something experienced, and this is what the phenomenal sense means, something that is experienced in itself and determinable in such experience. For Descartes, resistance amounts to no more than not yielding place. And this is something we could think of politically too, logistically, if you want, Arto, right? That is, not undergoing any change of location. A thing's resistance means that it stays in a definite place relative to another thing changing its place, or else that it changes its own location with a velocity that permits the thing to catch up with.
Is that what enframing is for Heidegger?
Enframing's probably on another level, because you need a cluster of meanings, right, or a cluster of a cluster of meanings or a cluster of phenomena coming together to enframe something, right?
So it's not really connected to his
Not yet.
reading
Yeah.
of Descartes.
Yeah. But when the experience of hardness is interpreted in this way, the kind of being that belongs to sensory perception is obliterated, and with it the possibility of grasping the being of those beings encountered at such perception. Descartes translates the kind of being, or the perception of something, into the only kind of being that he knows. The perception of something becomes a definite, objective presence of two objectively present res extensa next to each other. Right? This is the object world as it plays out. Right? The relation of their movements is itself a mode of extensio that primarily characterizes the objective presence of the corporeal thing. It is true that the possible fulfillment of the act of touching requires a distinctive nearness of what is touchable. But that does not mean that touching and the hardness made known in touching consist, ontologically understood, in different velocities of two corporeal things. Hardness and resistance did not show themselves at all unless there is a being, which has the kind of being of design, or at least of a living being. So it's not all going through, quote, the intellectia. This is what he's really trying to say here. This is why he brings in touch. Right? Thus, Descartes' discussion of the possible kinds of access to inner is dominated by an idea of being which is patterned after a particular region of these beings themselves, particular regions. And if you remember, later he'll speak about regions, right, in nearness and farness, right, later in this chapter on worldness. All right. The idea of being as constant present not only motivates an extreme definition of the being, of inner-worldly beings, and their identification with the world itself. At the same time, it blocks the possibility of bringing to view attitudes of design in a way which is ontologically appropriate. But thus the road is completely blocked to seeing the founded character of all sensuous, the founded character, important, of sensuous and intellective apprehension, and to understanding them as the possibility of being in the world. So this is the possibility of being in the world, and we're being blocked here because Descartes has no being in the world, right? This is one of the reasons he can't, right? But Descartes understands the being of design, to whose basic constitution it belongs, in the same way as the being of res extensa as substance. So in a way, we are the object, right? We are the object world. You begin to see this. We become datum, homo datum, or homo, guinea pig for science, right? Out of this moment, right here. So you begin to see how this is operative. But with these criticisms, have we not foisted upon Descartes a task altogether behind his horizon? He didn't have the means at the time, right? And then demonstrated that he failed to solve it. How could Descartes identify a definite inner-worldly being and its being with the world if he does not know the phenomena of world at all, and then something akin to inner-worldliness? Okay. In the realm of controversy over principles, one must not only attach oneself to theses which can be grasped doxographically, rather one must take the objective tendency of the problematic as an orientation, even if it does not go beyond a rather common version of that problematic. And here you go with the Althusserian notion of problematic too. How do you problematize, a series of objects, right? The fact that Descartes not only wanted to raise the question of ego and world with his doctrine of thinking thing and extended thing, but claimed to give a radical solution becomes clear, especially in Meditations 1 and 4. The preceding discussion should have demonstrated that the basic ontological orientation towards the tradition, devoid of any positive criticism, made it impossible for him to clear the way for a primordial ontological problematic of Dasein, and necessarily distorted his view of the phenomena of the world and forced the ontology of the world into the ontology of a particular inner-worldly being. All right, again, can you imagine? You write a good philosophical paper, and this is the critical remarks on the side. What you did not see, what you did not problematize. And in a certain way, he's doing this as from his position. One might object, however, that even if the problem of world and also the being of beings encountered in the surrounding world indeed remains obscured, Descartes nevertheless laid the foundation for the characteristic of that inner-worldly being, which in its being is the basis for every other being, material nature. The other strata of inner-worldly reality are based upon it, the fundamental stratum. The definite properties show themselves as qualities, but which are basically quantitative modifications of the modes of extensio itself, initially have their basis in the extended thing as such. Specific qualities such as beautiful, not beautiful, fitting, unfitting, usable, unusable, then find a footing in these qualities which themselves are further reducible. Right? So he's going through the Husserlian phenomenological reductions here to go through it, right? And he's showing this at work in the Cartesian model. These specific qualities must be understood in a primary orientation to thingliness as non-quantifiable value predicates through which the thing, initially merely material, gets stamped as something good. But with this stratification, we come, after all, to the being that we characterized ontologically, and again, you can put in the margins here, Zuhanden, the things ready to hand, the useful thing at hand, right? Thus, the Cartesian analysis of the world first makes possible a secure erection of the structure of what is initially at hand. It only needs to round out the natural thing so that it can become in every sense a thing of use, a task that easily accomplished. But apart from the specific problem is the being of the world, is the being of what we initially encounter in the world ontologically attainable in this way. When we speak of material thingliness, do we not tacitly posit a kind of being, the constant objective presence of a thing which is so far from being rounded out ontologically by subsequently outfitting things with value predicates that these value characters themselves rather remain onto-qualities of a being which has the kind of being of a thing instead of our design, right? The addition of value predicates is not in the least able to tell us anything new about the being of goods, but rather again only presupposes for them the kind of being of mere objective presence. Values are objective, present determination of a thing, right? And this is an origin of value, in a sense. And this is, again, to go back to the history of philosophy and thinking, this is an argument with Delphi, in terms of how do we make value judgments? Where do these come from? Is this really, at the base of everything, in terms of going forward? Can we really have a philosophy of values that is so-called, fundamental to where we're going, right? Yeah. And then you can ask this question of Marx, too, when you begin to talk about use and exchange value. What is the value of this? What is the value of in Marx? What does this really mean? So he really raises a lot, as we go forward. Okay, so you kind of get the idea here. I don't want to read the entire passage. I hope, right? I mean, we pretty much have it here. So anyway, let me just say a couple of things about So most of you know mathematics is always going to deal with the axiomatic, right? And an axiomatic is always intuitive and evident, right? And this is why you have the Vorhanden, the present thing, right? The immediate givenness of something. Again, the datum, if you want to talk that way. Also, maybe even the intuition, right? Of the essence or the intuitively evident, right? So the ground of thinking, in what Heidegger is really talking about with Descartes, the fundamentum, is really the I that posits. We get back to this whole notion of the positing, right? And how do you posit? And what is this I-ness of the thing, of the I think? What is the I-ness of the I think? It's the I that posits, right? The thinking substance, or the thing that thinks. So Heidegger again is looking at the positum, right, of this subject, right? So the I becomes the subject or the self, right, in a sense, and the things themselves become, right, in this way, the objects, right, the things in the world, right. So you have this inversion. And it is in this time-space, moment in Descartes, this time-space moment of Descartes, in which reference and signs take place, relations among things and reference. It's through this positing. So if you can strip, or suspend all your notions of I refer to something, I do this, all of which are probably categories in your mind, and you go back and say, I think is a posit, right? And in this positiveness, right, in space and time, I begin to establish systems of reference and signs in terms of the things around me, right? The things that are ready to hand, right, versus that are present to hand. So you begin to think in terms of relational categories, right, if you will, instead of just one-to-one categories, or I refer to this or I refer to that. In some ways, this is interesting when you go back to, to Derrida and Rachel, can you just pour me a little bit of that water in the glass? Is that water in front of
It
you?
is.
Oh.
This is Darcy.
Oh, okay. All right. Well,
Oh, you can have it.
yeah? You
Yeah.
sure?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sparkling, watch out,
Sparkle. I can put it in
It
that
might,
bottle. I don't care.
explode.
No, go for
You
it.
can have the rest, there's a little bit in here.
Okay.
It's fine.
It's all right? Yeah, okay. You're right. You're right. Heidegger got the bath, yes.
There we go.
Okay.
Ready to hand.
Ready to hand. Ready to thumb, yeah. Yeah. Anyway. Let's get a napkin, I guess, huh? I got one here. Yeah. Anyway,
Oh, I think you have a paper towel.
Here's some, Michael.
oh, you got something?
Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, good. Yeah, because we don't want to get electrocuted.
No.
And we'll be really ready to hand.
Get a jolt.
Yeah. So again, yes, this relational thinking
Yeah.
that we don't, yeah, thanks. We don't engage in so much because we're not, and going on to section 29, at least attunement, in our daily attunements, we don't think relationally. We're thinking very much one-to-one. How do we get from here to there? How do we get to A to B? Right? Etc.
It is,
Right?
hold on, it's,
What happened?
it's cascading down.
Oh, it's cascading.
Following its
okay.
natural course.
Yes, okay. Yeah. Well, let's stop it.
Axiomatic.
Yeah, it's axiomatic trajectory, yes,
Yeah.
right. It's on the vector, huh?
Yeah. Get stuff out of here. I was wondering where this was coming from.
Yeah.
Thanks. Oops.
I'll worry about the book. I don't care about the,
Yeah, right.
yeah, anyway. Yeah. All right. Okay, let me just go back to one passage here. So the referential and the signs he'll go through and how we come to meaning, right, in this universe of worldliness and nearness and farness. Okay, let's look at the bottom of the page. Descartes, page 97, narrowed down the question of world to that of the thingliness of nature as that inner worldly being which is initially accessible. He strengthened the opinion that the supposedly strictest ontic knowledge of a being is also the possible access to the primary being of the thing discovered in such knowledge. But we must at the same time realize that the rounding out of an ontology of things are fundamentally on the same dogmatic basis as that of Descartes. We have already intimated that passing over the world and those beings initially encountered is not a matter of chance, nor an oversight which we could simply be made up for, but rather is grounded in the essential kind of being of design itself. When our analytic of design has made the most important structures of design transparent in the scope of the problematic, when we have assigned to being in general the horizon of its possible intelligibility, thus first making handiness and objective presence ontologically and primordially intelligible, then only can the critique of Cartesian ontology of the world, which is basically still customary today, claim its philosophical justification. Okay? To do this, we have to show several things. Right? So after all this destruction and explication of that, Heidegger is now going to have to give the philosophical justification of this. Why was the phenomena of world passed over at the beginning of the ontological tradition? Decisive for us, explicitly in Parmenides, where does the constant recurrence of the passing over come from? This is in the history of philosophy, going back again to the destruction of the history of ontology. Right? 2, why do interworldly beings take the place of the phenomena thus passed over as the ontological theme? 3, why are these beings initially found in nature? And 4, what is the rounding out of such an ontology of the world experienced as necessary take place with the help of the phenomena of value? Right? So he's asking these 4 questions in terms of the hermeneutic, right, of this moment of 17th century rationality, ushering in modern subjectivity through, René Descartes, and asking this question. that somehow from Parmenides to Descartes, right, the world is passed over, right? Passed over in terms of how Heidegger is using world, right? Okay? 2, why does the inner worldly beings take the place of the phenomena passed over as the ontological theme? Why does self become more prominent than world and not part of world, if you will, or the I-ness, or the cogito? Why are these beings initially found in nature? And he puts that in question, right? By nature. And why does the rounding out of such an ontology of the world, experienced as necessary, take place with the phenomena value? In the answers to these questions, a positive understanding of the problematic of world will be reached for the first time. So you're really getting an idea here of how, this mind is working, right? He has to establish a very, very deep problematic around one concept, that is the concept of world, right? And he's going to go through this all the way to Cartesian, ontic foundationalism, right? The ushering in of philosophical modernity. Also destroying the history of ontology, a positive destruction of the history of ontology from Parmenides up to 17th century rationality simultaneously, and at the same time begin to show intelligence, taking center stage, right, as a concept, a working concept, as we go forward into the scientific project, right, or into scientific rationality. Also to show space as three-dimensional, but as we've said, we're not looking at the world of that three-dimensionality, and also what is the design of that three-dimensionality as we experience it. Yep, as well as ultimately, looking at this as part of an epochal shift in the history of metaphysical thinking in Western, Western thought. Yep. All this is going on, right? So then he's going to go to the world design and inner worldly beings are the ontological constitutive states nearest to us, but we have no guarantee that we achieve the basis for encountering them phenomenally by the seemingly obvious procedure of starting with things of the world, still less by taking our orientation. Starting with things of the world, the extensio. Remember, we began back, earlier in this interpretation of the extensio, and from what's supposedly the most rigorous knowledge of beings. Our remarks about Descartes should have brought us to this insight. But if we recall that spatiality also manifestly constitutes inner worldly beings, it is, after all, possible to salvage the Cartesian analysis of the world in the long run, with his radical exposition of extensio as the presupposition for every quality of the bodily thing, right? Descartes prepared the way for the understanding of an a priori whose content Kant then made precise with greater penetration. Within certain limits, the analysis of extensio remains independent of his neglecting to provide an explicit interpretation of the being of extended beings. Taking extensio as the basic determination of the world has its phenomenological justification, although in recourse to it neither the spatiality of the world nor the spatiality initially discovered of beings encountered in the surrounding world, nor the spatiality of design itself can be conceived ontologically, only ontically. Okay? So, any thoughts? Because we go on, because he's going to now talk about the surrounding world, nearness and farness, and then he'll finish with handiness and design in space, right? He talks about regions, and these are regions of learning too, as well as, regions of place. He's going to think of this together, right? Regions that we think, because, in phenomenology, there are ontological regions of understanding. You say you have a regional study. So you're going to study, the topography of northern, red clay, Alabama. Right? Something like that. It's a regional study in a certain way. for, not region just as we understand it geographically, but also it's regional. It's not fundamental ontology, but it's a region of that fundamental, so it's the fundamental ontological approach to that, which yields a kind of regional study. What does it mean to see? What does it mean to be mute? Can the mute speak? Questions like this are all kind of regional, studies. How do you do this, right? I knew a blind person who could reproduce, chapters of this in his mind. It's like Stevie Wonder. You see the flash of being in the world, and then you go right to the, it's great, almost eidetic, but blind. This is a guy I knew in the '80s. Please.
If
This is okay, Rachel? I'm sorry, I just kind of very, okay.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are studies that show if you're blinded from early age,
Yeah.
other faculties become more potent, including eidetic imagery or whatever.
Right.
So it would make sense.
Diderot, a letter to the blind.
Who did?
Diderot wrote a
Okay.
beautiful letter to the blind, of which Derrida does a beautiful commentary on. He wrote on everything, Chris.
Yes.
God, like an old girlfriend in Italian studies at Johns Hopkins. God. She used to call him. It's God.
Diderot, God, or Derrida, or Heidegger?
Derrida.
Oh.
Derrida.
Oh, Derrida, I thought.
Yeah, God. As I said, even Derrida wrote on God. He wrote on everything.
But only Spinoza defined God in the first 5 lines of the book.
Yes. It was God a rhetorical construct.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry, I have to go in.
That's okay.
I can't be here next week either. But,
Okay. Next week we're going to do the being in the world, and we're going to be speaking a little more about understanding and interpretation, discourse, and language. So 31 through 34 for next week, 138 to 160. And then we'll go on, we'll juxtapose that. I mean, if you have time, you can read Idle Talk, Curiosity, Ambiguity, and Falling Prey. But yeah, we're gonna go through that, and then we're gonna break, and then we're gonna come back. And my thinking is we should read the sections on time, and then we'll come back retrospectively if your guys are good with this. I mean, that's a kind of reading strategy. If you want to do it on the continuum, it's fine with me too, but I thought maybe it would help if we did sections 75 through 83 on temporality, time within timeness, his differeces about history, all these kind of things. We'll do that, and then we go, backwards from there. We'll read it time after time, backwards, right? And then we'll go to history. Right? There's a very good section on time and history. I mean, there's something in here for everybody in the disciplines, believe me. So you have time and history, and then you have the summons, right? You have summons of being, right? So you get the legalistic language, and I've always thought, about Kafka before the law and the summons, right? Understanding the summons and guilt in chapter 2. So we're going to talk about anticipatory resoluteness and authenticity. But yeah, I don't want to keep you. Thank you. I thought we'd do a little more, and then we're gonna,
okay. So in 2 weeks you'll still be here?
No, in 2 weeks we'll be, I guess, vacationing.
Okay.
So I'm thinking, but I'll send out an email. If people want to meet the 20, I'm going to be here, but I doubt people are going to be here. That's a Saturday before Christmas Day. But I'm thinking I will be here the 30th, but that's the weekend before New Year's Day. I was thinking January 15th. It's another starting point. That would be not the 15th, the 13th. The 13th, the 20th, and the 27th in January. And we'll use LIU. I don't have this. I'm not going through this. If this continues, I'm not going to let Stanley come here and get sick. I mean, this is another stupid thing. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, if you guys are cold, I mean, I can stop. But I thought we could do a little more. It's up to you. If you're cold, I mean, I don't mind.
I wasn't cold. It's fine.
Yeah. You're cold too?
It's freezing.
Yeah, it is. I mean, no, it's awful. Yeah. Okay, so let me just mention a couple of other things. But I mean, I want to know, you kind of see what's going on here? I mean, this is really a proto deconstruction, if you will, of Cartesian spatiality in the name of world, right? And he has these concepts such as nearness and farness, right, that he's going to play with in this double. You know, Heidegger is always about the step back, right? And the step into the future. So you can think of it this way. There's always this two-step going on methodologically, right? He's going to work with, so being near and being far
He replaces the
simultaneously.
Cartesian measurement of length and steps with nearness and farness.
That's well put. I would say he radicalizes it into, yeah.
Almost intuitively, the distance.
Right. There's something to be said for living in the hut. Yeah. By the way. Yeah.
The Passion of Joan of Arc.
Yes.
I saw the new restoration that Chris was talking about. It's wonderful.
Okay.
So if people, it's really.
And Antoine Artaud's face is very
Oh, wow.
chiseled and yeah.
Falconetti,
Yeah.
yes.
So very, very, very.
Mark Howard
yeah.
is the good guy, though.
He's the good guy in this one.
I
yeah.
told you.
He was the good guy. Yeah. He was the
Became
good
cruel
guy.
later, but,
Yeah. He was the good guy. I think. Anyway. All right. So the other thing I want to do today, maybe we can go to 29. We're going to be being in, and as I mentioned, chapter 5, 127, as I mentioned here, the being in is very, very important, right? Very, very, very important, the in. You know, being in a world, right? So you can see on page 130, we shall treat Dasein as attunement, and fear as a mode of attunement. Dasein is understanding. This is the third paragraph. Understanding and interpretation. Statement, making a statement, enunciation, enunciative statements. You begin to see a lot of Foucault coming out of this and the archaeology of knowledge. Yeah. And then section 30, Dasein, discourse, and language, right? So this is what we're going to be doing over the next, week. Next week or so. Okay? Now, above the two equipped primordially constitutive ways to be there in attunement is basically an understanding, right? And I have that on the diagram, again, the attunement and understanding side by side, right? And this is very important again. And then part B, he'll analyze our idle talk, curiosity, and ambiguity as existential modes, right, of the everyday being. And then interpretation, meaning belonging to the understanding. And then the entanglement or ensnarement. I kind of like entanglement. And then falling in because, part of the project of Heidegger, once again, as I've mentioned, is the unlearning. Very hard for us to do. Very hard for us to do is this unlearning and this disentanglement. It's very, very difficult exercise. But this is what's happening. The radical part of philosophy, 20th and early 21st century, is really about unlearning, undoing, disentangling, the mess that thought, and systems of thinking, got us into and how dominative they have become. And this is the radical part of this. It means to reroute something in a very alternative fashion, right? And at the same time, that alternative is not about nostalgic blood and soil like Bannon and company, and or folk principles, or we're anti-capitalist. I mean that so is the Volk in Germany, right? We're anti-capitalist too. But anyway, the issue really is to reroute, right, in such a way that you begin to get a ground of the fundamentals of the question of being, to be able to see this process at work and what needs to be undone. So our thing, in terms of world, one of the reasons I want to move to attunement is once you're aware of encompassing, surrounding, and I'm not just talking about surrounding world, we're talking about trying to think beyond space and time, right, into place and time, and also think, you know, in a very different, you know, sense, directionality. That, you know, the first step of that is your attunement, right? How you were attuned to the world, right? So that's why I wanted to go to this, the existential constitution of the there. What is the da of the sein, right? And this begins on page 130. And let's read a little bit of this and then we'll go. What we indicate ontologically with the term attunement is ontologically what is most familiar and an everyday kind of thing. And that is mood. Mood. Being in a mood. Before all psychology of moods, a field which moreover still lies fallow, we must see this phenomena as a fundamental existential and outline its structure. Okay? So the fundamental structure here is attunement, right? And we must outline it. Both the undisturbed equanimity and inhibited discontent of everyday heedfulness, the way we slide over from one to another or slip into bad moods, are by no means nothing ontologically, although these phenomena remain unnoticed as what is supposedly the most indifferent and fleeting in Dasein. This is section 29, Chris, second paragraph. Yep, Dasein is attunement. The fact that moods can be spoiled and changed only means that Dasein is always already in a mood. Yeah. The often persistent, smooth, and pallid lack of mood, which, and this is, you know, you say the person's without affect, they're in a mood, right? You're in a mood, huh, man? Yeah. Yeah. Which must not be confused with a bad mood, is far from being nothing. Rather, in this Dasein becomes tired of itself. What was her name in the X-Files?
Scully.
Scully, yeah, right, Scully. Yeah, Scully. That's how kind of an image of Scully. But in a mood, you know. Right. The being of the there, what's that?
She was tortured by.
Yes, tortured, yeah. The being of the there has, in such a bad mood, become manifest as a burden. One does not know why. And Dasein cannot know why, because the possibilities of disclosure belonging to cognition fall short of the primordial disclosure. So we cannot know moods.
It's interesting. It's a limit.
Beautiful.
It's identifying a limit.
Beautiful. Beautiful. In which Dasein is brought before its being as the there. You know? So if you're a good therapist, you're going to say, are you there? Instead of, you know, undoing the, you know, yeah. Is the cognition. This is why cognitive psychology is a joke, in my opinion. I mean, you know, I'm just saying, you know, there's a lot of cognitivist practice out there that some is cognitive behaviorism, cognitive psychology in some ways. I mean, I don't really mean it's only a joke, but I don't want to be so dismissive. But anyway, on another level, this is much more powerful.
Is
Because
that
you're
the
really
dominant school, the cognitive, that's the dominant school.
it's one of the dominant schools. Yeah, very much operative. Yeah. Just if you know, you're going to get better, right? You can know how to change those patterns, right, et cetera, you know. And then of course you have alongside that the behaviorism. Yeah. Given where we are, behaviorism wouldn't be so bad, you know, on some of these subjects out here. Yeah. Anyway, furthermore, an elevated mood can alleviate the manifest burden of being. But the possibility of this, here's your friend Peter, if you want, yeah, right here, see? But the possibility of this, you know, discovers the burdensome character of Dasein, even when it alleviates that burden. Mood makes manifest how one is and is coming along. In this how one is, being in a mood also brings it being to its there. You could have smoked up here, man, if you give us some heat. Jim, yeah. Okay, all right. All right. In being in a mood, Dasein is always already disclosed in accordance with its mood as that being to which Dasein was delivered over in its being as the being which it, existing, has to be. To be disclosed does not, as such, mean to be known.
That's interesting.
Yes, right?
counterintuitive, based
yeah.
on what,
You want to be a defense lawyer? You can think about this with me too. Right?
you can disclose, but you're not, no.
Right. And how did you know that? Yeah, anyway. So, the pure that it is, well, anyway, and even most indifferent, what this fits too, and harmless everydayness, the being of design can burst forth as the naked that it is and has to be. Right? The pure that it is shows itself, the whence and whither remain obscure. The fact that design normally does not give in to such everyday moods, we're on page 131, Jeremy, attunement, okay. The fact that design normally does not give in to such everyday moods, that is, does not pursue what they disclose and does not allow itself to confront what has been disclosed, is no evidence against the phenomenal fact of the mood-like disclosure of the being of the there, in that it's that, but is rather evidence for it. For the most part, design evades the being that is disclosed in moods in an ontic and existential way. Ontologically and existentially, this means that even in that to which such a mood pays no attention, design is unveiled in its being delivered over to the there. In the evasion itself, the there is something disclosed. So there's no escape, right? Even in avoidance. There's no flight, in a certain way. There's always the there. We shall call this character a being of design which is veiled in its whence and whither, but in itself all the more openly disclosed that it is the thrownness, how we are thrown. How the dice, to use Mallarmé, how the dice have been rolled. How we're thrown. It's interesting. Every revolution is the throw of the die.
Stiegler, every morning you read Mallarmé, right, in prison.
Yes.
Yeah, so
Can never
That gets you through the day.
throw
Then
the
you
dice.
do read the sod for the night, but anyway.
Throw the dice will never obliterate chance.
Yes, exactly. That's right. So it's interesting, huh? This is really how we're thrown, right? Attunement into the there,
This is
into the
also-
there.
Altusser's allegory of the encounter is kind of like.
Yes, it's
it
very
comes from
much
here.
like the
It
allegatory.
comes
of
from
the-
here,
Yeah, I
in a
mean,
sense.
sometimes these people, look, they're not thinking parallel
Yeah.
always to each other, but they're very close in proximity in terms of where they have come from, how they've been educated, especially people of the Althusserian, Badiou, Stiegler type, these people come out of a very similar, background, right, in some ways. So, and this is, again, very powerful when you begin to think you're no longer talking about, I'm in a bad mood. It's the there of that mood that is really the starting point. And think about this therapeutically, too. When you start to think about how you're thrown on a given day, and that you begin your analysis from that analysis literally meaning to undo, right? That's what it means, or to free up, in a sense. What that really could yield as a powerful therapeutic tool.
We're thrown every day.
Yeah, well, yes, we're thrownness. Yeah, we're
I thought we're
thrownness.
thrown when we're born.
We are. That's part of the natality, but it still is going on in terms of our moods, our there-ness,
Okay.
because he's relating this to moods, to attunement, right? To how we're attuned to everyday life. Of this being into its there is thrown in such a way that it is the there as being in the world. The expression thrownness is meant to suggest the facticity of its being delivered over. The that it is and has to be disclosed in the attunement of Dasein is not the that which expresses ontologically and categorically the factuality belonging to objective presence. The latter is accessible only when we ascertain it by looking at it. Rather, the that disclosed in attunement must be understood as an existential attribute of that being which is in the mode of being in the world. Facticity is not the factuality of the brute facts of something objectively present, but is a characteristic of the being of design, taken on in existence, although initially thrust aside. The that of facticity is never to be found just by looking. Okay? It's interesting, huh? Yeah. Beings of the character of design are there in such a way that they find themselves in their thrownness, whether explicitly or not. In attunement, design is always already brought before itself. It has always already found itself, not as perceiving oneself to be there, but as one finds oneself in attunement. This is your first predicate, is your attunement. And I mean, this goes back to this whole musicality that we were talking about in terms of Adorno, right? And also in terms of Plato's founding discourses of the Academy. Yeah, music is the foundational discourse in the Academy. So, as a being which is delivered over it, found, which comes not from a direct seeking, but from a fleeing. As a being which is delivered over it is also delivered over the fact that it must always have already found itself in a finding which comes not from a direct seeking, but from a fleeing. So sometimes this is this flight from a mood, right? Or a flight from our thrownness that makes us understand our there-ness. Mood does not disclose in the mode of looking at thrownness, but is turning toward and away from it. So for the most part, mood does not itself turn towards the burdensome character of Dasein manifested in it. It does this least of all, in an elevated mood in which this burden is lifted. This turning away is always what is in the mode of attunement. So what it discloses, mood, phenomenally, and how it discloses would be completely misunderstood if what has been disclosed was conflated with that which attuned Dasein at the same time is acquainted with, knows, and believes. Even when Dasein is sure of its whither in faith or thinks it knows about its whence in rational enlightenment, all of this makes no difference in the face of the phenomenal fact that moods bring Dasein before the that of its theirs, which stares directly at it with the inexorability of an enigma. Existentially and ontologically, there is not the slightest justification for minimizing the evidence of attunement by measuring it against the apodictic certainty of the theoretical cognition of something always objectively present. Cannot be measured scientifically, right? But the falsification of the phenomena, which banishes them to the sanctuary of the irrational, is no better. Irrationalism is the counterpart of rationalism, talks about the things to rationalism is blind, but only with a squint. Okay? That a design factically can, should, and must master its mood with knowledge, and will may signify a priority of willing and cognition and certain possibilities of existing. But that must not mislead us into ontologically denying mood as a primordial, and this is important, kind of being of design, in which it is disclosed to itself before before cognition, before the knowing process, and willing and beyond their scope of disclosure. You're thrown into a world, right? Before cognition, right? Etc.
So that's definitely
Okay.
post-Cartesian formulation.
Oh yes, definitely.
This is where he's
Yeah, you're being in a
beginning
world.
his
Yes.
post-Cartesian.
You're in a world now. You're being in a world. Yes, it's certainly post-Cartesian. Yeah. Moreover, we never master a mood by becoming free of a mood, but always through a counter move. The first essential ontological characteristic of attunement is attunement discloses Dasein in its thrownness, and initially, for the most part, in the mode of the evasive turning away. We are according to Heidegger, in this thrownness, we're very prone to avoidance.
Oh yeah.
Yes. Can't face the void. That's the most interesting part. We're alpha privative void. Yeah, please.
In Minima Moralia, Adorno has this fragment where he says, the splinter in your eye is the greatest magnifying glass. Is that like some sort of veiled, or not so veiled, attack on this notion of squinting as diminutive as opposed to being the vantage point that one should aspire to?
I think Adorno is probably talking more like the Andalusian dog when you have the razor that cuts the eye so you can really see, and that the best magnifying glass is that splinter in the eye that's been cut open, to
They
really
cut the
see.
dogs in Andalusia.
Yeah.
They cut the woman's
The
eye.
woman's eye, cut across it, like this. It's a famous thing with the razor
Yeah.
going across very slowly
They cut
across
to the
there.
moon.
Yeah, the cut to the moon.
That's horrifying.
Well, that was
Yeah,
Buñuel's intention. It was more horrifying when he and Dali dressed as nuns and got on buses in Paris and started to terrify all the Parisian people. They used to play those kind of games. But yeah, it's probably a reference to that. I don't think he had this in mind about the squinting. I think that for Adorno, it was really the question of refraction and reflection, that you're not able to really reflect until you have that refractive capacity to see. I mean, I don't really know I'm just interpreting, but in a way, I think he is much more aware of this. You really have to be blind to see, in a sense, which goes back to, King Oedipus is blind. It's only through blindness that you really gain the insight, right? And in some ways, kind of a play on that, right?
Very Elijah Muhammad-esque.
What's that, Elijah
Very
Muhammad?
Muhammad-esque.
Oh, well,
Yeah,
I'm
well,
not feeling good company.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Goldman's book, Blindness and Insight.
That's true.
Yeah.
That was the title of the essays, yes. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's where he's coming from more. Although Heidegger is not privileged, I mean, in world, he does go through verbs. You weren't here, but I did a little something on the sict, the verbs of seeing and circumspection and being circumspect, and these kind of things. That he does have this operating in world, but really for Heidegger, ultimately, it's about the hearing. And in Adorno too, I think, because of regressive hearing is one of his best essays, in a sense. One of his very best essays about how regressive hearing takes place. Listen, again, this whole thing of rationalism and irrationalism, for Heidegger, these are binaries, again, just like what Chris was mentioning about, nearness and farness, there's a collapse into this. So the binaries here for him, become a squint, right, from rationalism, looking back on irrationalism, and for him, he wants to go beyond these binaries and these traditional ways of looking at things. So this is another reason that he begins. Our primordial state, if you will, in the world, this attunement, right, is really measured, or can be looked at in terms of mood, right? And the mood itself is part of the world into which we're thrown, right? We're already thrown into this mood. It's not something that someone puts you in a bad mood. It's part of the da, right? So So when someone says you're making me unhappy, to Heidegger, no, it's the da that the unhappiness has already you've been thrown into it. Yeah, please. Yeah. Oh, you had it. Okay. So anyway, let's go on. And then we'll finish because my hands are freezing over too. Anyway, so the squint, we never can master a mood, etc. The evasive turning away. We can already see that attunement is far removed, and again, the antagonist here is psychology and psychologism, right? From anything like finding a psychical, condition, right? So he wants to stay away out of the discipline of psychology, which he considers, part of the old objectively present, the moment of, the vorhandenness, if you will. He was not particularly fond of psychoanalysis either. Far from having the character of an apprehension which first turns itself around and then turns back, all immanent reflection can find experiences only because it is always disclosed in attunement, right? You have to have the attunement. So attunement is the presupposition on which most of your reflections take place. Mere mood discloses the there more primordially, but it also closes it off more stubbornly than any not perceiving. So bad moods demonstrate this. In bad moods, Dasein becomes blind to itself. The surrounding world of heedfulness is veiled. So this is interesting, the kind of description of bad moods, right? Attunement is so far from being reflected upon that you're so far from attunement. That's what you tell someone when they're in a bad mood, I guess. Heidegger. You're so far away from attunement. What's wrong with,
If you're in a bad mood, you have to move. Go to another there. No?
Not so easy. I wish.
The bad follows you there.
Yeah.
Find another
It'll
job.
follow you.
There
Follow you.
travels with you.
Narnia.
Yes, that's
It's
the
an
thing.
argument.
You know how it goes. You don't like the country, leave it, right? Yeah.
Right,
They
well,
love it
can't-
or leave
country
it.
comes with
Yeah. Goes with you, man.
There's no there there.
Yeah, right.
That's a great answer to the Trump, right? Like
Yeah.
to these racists.
Yeah.
Just leave the country. Yeah, but you're gonna come with me.
Yeah, that's right. It's the same mood. Right. So this is good, right? Attunement, and so far from being reflected upon that in the unreflected devotion to and giving into the world of its heedfulness, it assails Dasein. So you're assailed by mood. This is interesting. This is very violent.
Very violent.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but it is. But, it's real. Mood assails. It comes neither from without nor from within, but rises from being in the world as a mode of that being. But thus, by negatively contrasting attunement with a reflective apprehension of the inner, we arrive at a positive insight into its character of disclosure. Mood is always already disclosed being in the world as a whole, and first makes possible directing oneself towards something. Being attuned is not initially related to something psychical. It is itself not an inner condition, and this is why you can't move from one to another, which then in some mysterious way reaches out and leaves its mark on things and persons. And the second essential characteristic of attunement shows itself in this. It is a fundamental existential mode of the equiprimordial disclosiveness of world. Dasein with and existence, because this disclosure itself is essentially being in the world. Okay? Think how far we want to go with this. Okay. I think I should wait till next week because I can put some stuff on the board about the Stoics and apatheia and Augustine and Pascal, and then we can go on to fear. So why don't we begin with attunement next week, which is, the Bestimmung, which also means determination, attunement, right? It also is a word that is used as determination. So why don't we begin, read this 28, and I'll send out an email. We'll go 28 through 34, up to the questions of language, right? Yeah? And this will be good because this is going to be part and parcel of things that in the existential analytic that we're going to begin to see structures at work, right? At work, yeah? And we begin to talk about angst and fear as modes of
which is the
attunement.
fundamental structure, right, that shapes us.
Well, it's one of we essentially
Fear of death.
are mere anxiety at bottom.
And thus the temporal dimension is part of this.
The temporal dimensions is very connected to being towards death.
Because that's
Right.
how we achieve attunement in a sense, right? Through our perception of time or a realization of this temporal aspect that we're getting close to our sort of demise.
The closer you are in touch with your mortality, the more the temporal, aspect becomes more and more authentic, because then you begin to experience Dasein as anticipatory resoluteness. You're resolute towards the future and not towards the past, or you're not wishy-washy, or you're not ambiguous, or you're not whatever. So there becomes this, and that's when you begin to build projects. The relationship between this Gevortheit, this thrownness and attunement is also connected to project and projection.
Or if you live in the now, quote unquote, and you've lost your sense of this movement towards, then you don't have any projects. You just sort of
The now is
exists.
like you're almost like a passive receptacle. I mean, which
And that's
is
the
most of
worst,
the culture
the
right
mediocrity
now.
of the average.
The mediocrity of the average everydayness is living in the now time. The real
Being the
question
moment.
is that capitalism has mastered now time. This is where we are. I mean, you know, if you want to start thinking about this vis-a-vis the political economy of the time, right, and what is being mastered out here, it is the mastery of the now, and that the essence of time is basically speed to capitalism. You know, it's the speed of, you know, so we're trying to think this through, I mean, or at least get some parameters to work with on this. Yeah. So, yeah, Nori, yeah.
Just one.
Yeah, sure, no problem. Yeah, what's up?
Because I remember that it's going back to the question of end-framing that Alpha
Yes,
was saying
end-framing,
earlier.
yeah.
And I remember that you said end-framing was picked up by Alpha in the framework of ideological state apparatus.
Apparatus is the word that is used for the German Gestalt. So framework is the same as apparatus. The German translation of Gestalt, in which you have a constellation. Stellung is a verb that kind of gives you a constellation of meanings, right? The Stellung. So a presentation, Darstellung, Vorstellung, representation.
So the
All of
school-
these things, the presending is a presentation, or the representation is a repetition of what the, you know, the present
So the
scene of
school,
the
for Althusser, inframes us, essentially, right?
the schools
That's
are
what he
completely
said.
inframed.
Which is totally
Yeah,
inframed
it's
us
framing
in
you up
certain
all the
ways.
time, and you can look at syllabus and curriculum as reserved stock in certain ways in Heideggerian language. It's reserved stock that is supposed to make you, you know, who you are, you know, is really to make you a constitutive Dasein without understanding the there or the avoidance. Just stay within this language. I don't,
Yeah.
you know, we don't have to only use this language. Yeah, but yeah.
It's interesting. To what extent do you think this idea of the Cartesian framework
Yeah.
is kind of comparable to the idea of framing?
Comparable to what?
To just the framing itself.
Well, it's certainly being used, I mean, you know, in terms of, you know, framing up people, and it's actually dominated as a worldview projection.
Yes.
I mean, what Cartesianism has done to us is it has built a world image. We have image thoughts, we have image, you know, that we live in this kind of world of, you know, yes, of being framed. But, you know, in Heidegger's sense, the enframing is also a kind of, you know, you watch B-52s at work. You watch air, you know, war games at work. This is all part of the Gestalt going on. Nuclear silos, you know, reserve stock. He's looking at this in terms of technology, what technology has yielded to us and how we think this way. Why would we have reserve stock of all this uranium and, you know, U-238? And yeah, you see, so he's trying to look at this in terms of what has this era, this epoch, as we sort of still on the transition, maybe getting closer, why Stiegler and other people are popular to be read and to be thought about, is we're on the cusp of moving from self-consciousness to, you know, techno, you know, we don't know what it is yet. We don't know what this cyber self or this cybernaut or whatever we're going to really, you know, what the there will be, right, in a sense. So for Heidegger, this was both frightening and liberating, you know, that you might be freed of letting through, you know, all this stuff that could be used productively, you know, for a new epoch, right, in terms of, you know, but that's why he's always saying, I'm preparing the ground, you know, everything's propedeutic. So, yes, but the Cartesian is about domination, yes. So, yes, the domination of nature, in Descartes' terms, it was for men. Descartes would be advocating for, obviously, for single health care, you know, payer care, for good social security, all these things, because he was interested in this stuff. Yeah, and the certainty of such. The certainty of such, yeah. Yeah, there actually was a mark. I forgot the guy's name. I have the book. I haven't looked at it in years, but someone took Descartes and a French Marxist and tried to make him as a, you know, the basis for new social sciences that would yield more positive results. I'll take a look at it, you know, over the Christmas break and you know, try to refamiliarize myself with it. But anyway, no, the point here is that the Cartesian model yielded a domination. you know, that we are, you know, we're part of this Promethean, you know, myth, right? That we can muster the forces of natures to the point of every, you know, we have a Faustian bargain, if you will, with nature. That we can make it conform, harness it to our own ends. For Heidegger, this is, you know, completely inherently wrong, intrinsically wrong, and does not take into account world at all.
So ideological critique was so embedded in Heidegger, but he
Well, he never used that language. No,
but it's
no.
there.
Yeah, no, of course it's there. Yeah, he doesn't use that language. For him, it's just, you know, I mean, he doesn't use the word ideology because for him, ideology, you know, ideology is from Descartes de Tracy. You know, ideology began as a way of learning chemistry. Textbooks, you know, that's where ideology comes from. Yeah, Descartes de Tracy. Yeah. Well before Marx. And it's used, and then Marx uses it, and the way we take it up is from the German ideology, right? As representative of the material force of class rule or the ruling class ideology, and we try to see battles of ideologies. Foucault, you know, got stabs in at Althusser when he said, for those of us who still stupidly think in ideologies. This was Foucault's comment about this, where he went and he never used that word at all. You know, and you don't see ideology being used by Adorno or the Frankfurt School. You know, you have it in other people, but you don't see it being used. You know, very, very few. I mean, they are aware of ideology critique, but they don't use this language in a overly operative sense. So, I mean, the interesting thing about Althusser is it's relational because he's talking about, on one hand, the repressive state apparatuses, which is the law, the police, you know, the judiciary, all these levels, right, versus that of the ideological. No longer, in my opinion, do they need the ideological. They've conquered that, you know, the system. You know, this is what we're witnessing today is with the Roy Moores and this kind of stuff. When Steve Bannon can come out and say, you know, we're anti-capitalist. You heard this before today? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't want to reduce Althusser to this.
Yeah, no,
But it does. I say it comes out of his Catholicism, which connects up to the point you were making about Descartes.
Yes.
I mean, the whole idea of interpolation is so.
Yes, that's true.
You learn that at CCD class.
And you learn that from Tertullian, one of the church fathers. He's the first thinker of interpolation. Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
What's CCD class?
Oh, I'm sorry. That's what we call it in Jersey. It's like Sunday school for Catholics.
Oh.
I forgot.
We have all these little slogans. He's from Jersey, you know?
I knew that way. No.
He's
but
not
I
from
got
Newark.
people there.
No, he knows a lot of people.
Sounds like a gorilla
Actually,
subunit.
He knows all the gorillas. Well,
Yeah.
we're going to say.
No, I just said there was my comrade of ours is the mayor of Newark, and it's an optimistic thing because there was this challenge on the internet for people to show like selfies with books, and his books was William Patterson, Paul Robeson, We Charge Genocide,
Baraka?
Baraka,
It's a
Angela
Baraka.
Davis's autobiography, and Dimitrov towards the United Front. So I was like, can you imagine all the mayors reading those?
Good luck. Yeah, I can see, you know, the mayor of New Orleans reading those. Birmingham,
You don't see De
Alabama.
Blasio reading?
De Blasio doesn't know how to read.
I know he's got that glow. Like when he
Yeah, too much. Yeah, but I mean, going back to this problem of the apparatus, you know, the French, you know, basically are translating a lot of this, the Gestell, right, is being translated as apparatus, right? It's also used in camera, you know, in languages of, you know, photography and cinema.
How do you spell
Cinematic
that?
apparatus.
Gestell?
G-E-hyphen S-T-E-L-L. Yeah. And Stell and Stellung in German means that you're in a constellation. Yeah. You're in a constellation. You're around a cluster of things. So Vorstellung, Darstellung, all these things, representation, presentation, you know, are all part of, you know, the cluster of you know, thoughts. Yeah. So yeah, and that's, you know, so it fits too, because, you know, what does the school do? It frames you up, right? I mean, you're framed up for the reproduction of the system, right? Yeah, from day one, yeah, you're interpolated as a subject.
You interpret
Supposed to,
essays, you
and then-
interpret, you
Yes.
don't think, you interpret. I mean,
Yes.
to use Heidegger's language.
Right, right.
Thinking comes before interpretation.
So it's a prison to prison pipeline.
One prison to another prison.
That's
right.
societies of
That's
control,
right.
right?
That's
The
right.
flow.
Absolutely.
One
it's a
prison to
society of
another.
control. Absolutely. Yeah.
These
Yeah.
people were so smart. They figured it out.
Oh, they had it all
The
figured out.
roadmap for
You
the
can
next
imagine.
revolution is already in front of us.
Well,
We
yes,
just need the
absolutely
Leninist
true.
organization of a new kind.
Well, I'm waiting, man.
That's
I'm
what we
waiting.
need.
I mean, I'm told my
Everything is
gun's
mapped
only
out.
good for shooting ducks. You know,
I think it's
mean,
going to be much more violent next time around. As Adorno said about the bomb, it's going to require far greater violence or danger on part of the revolutionaries.
I'm thinking about it.